Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. So today we're going to continue our series on common misconceptions in the health and fitness industry. Today we're going to discuss mobility and common misconceptions there. So as we define mobility, we're going to be discussing it as more joint mobility or overall the body's ability to get into a position. All right, so we're not going to try to delineate between muscular mobility or any other specific soft tissue mobility like fascial mobility, but we want to speak just more generally and more broadly about being able to get into different positions functionally. And oftentimes we really want to understand that from a joint perspective, but on top of all of that will be all the soft tissues that are involved in movement. So we can't really talk about mobility in isolation because that's just not how the body moves. All of the joints and soft tissues are always working together to allow us to get into the positions we want to get to. But the first and most common misconception that I see is that mobility is the same thing as stretching. So if we want to get more mobile, we need to stretch more. And sometimes stretching is involved in this process. However, it very often is just a byproduct of us trying to change our position and be able to get into better positions. And oftentimes, if we feel a stretch, we are not actually in the position that we want to get to. So we can feel a stretch and feel like we are stretching without actually improving our joint mobility. And this happens quite a bit. The other piece about stretching is that some muscles in the body do really well at being stretched because they have long levers. It's really easy to stretch them. But other muscles in the body are smaller, and the joints around those muscles still need to be mobilized, but you can't often feel the stretch very well around those muscles. And this happens specifically when we're starting to work on rotation at different joints, like rotation in the hips, rotation at the shoulders, is if we seek out the stretch, we're oftentimes missing the actual limitation that we're trying to improve. So oftentimes improving mobility does not feel like stretching at all. It feels more like we're hitting barriers and then we're actually trying to get stronger in the direction of our limitation. So broadly, and this will carry over to the other misconceptions that I talk about, we can view mobility, or the way I view it, is a combination of posture, the breath control, and then direction. All right. And with posture, we're not looking at necessarily a perfect posture, but we want to have an idea for where our trunk is, where our head is, where our rib cage is, and where our pelvis is. Say we're trying to move an extremity like our hip or our shoulder, we need to know what's going on with our head, our rib cage, and our pelvis. That has to stay stable in order for us to move the joint we want to move from. So we have to always have an entity that is staying solid and stable while we try to mobilize something else. And that's really important. So that's where the postural element comes from. And it connects to this idea of mobility cannot be distinct from stability. So that's the number two misconception that I see. Oftentimes, mobility gets discussed as separate from stability. We will do our things to stabilize our core. We'll work on things that feel more like strength training for stability. And then mobility will feel more like we're stretching and that it's a little bit more toned down. And it's unnecessary. Now, like any movement process, there is a spectrum of how we can do that movement process. So when we're trying to improve strength, we can go really, really high intensity with that, or we could be a little bit lower intensity and we can kind of build that up. Mobility is really the same way, where we can be more low intensity. We can focus more on relaxation. Our breath pattern, our breath control could be quite a bit different, or we could be very high intensity and it's still considered mobility, where we're focusing more on contracting our muscles in the direction of our limitations. Right? So mobility doesn't need to feel like relaxation. It doesn't need to feel like stretching, and it doesn't need to be distinct from the idea of stability, because you always need to stabilize one entity while you mobilize another if mobility is going to actually be accurate and if we're going to be able to get more relative motion in each joint. So this, that second misconception is looking at mobility and stability as two sides of the same coin. All right, so something always needs to be stable. Oftentimes we're talking about that more at the trunk, more proximal, head, rib cage, pelvis. We want to keep that more stable while we say try to move our shoulder, or we try to move our hip or our knee. We have to understand that the area that we're trying to move from, the joint above it, and the other joints above that need to stay in a fixed position relatively so that we can move from where we want to move from. So that's really important. And when we look at mobility and stability, it's helpful to just try to define the movement that we're trying to get better at, the functional movement we're trying to get better at. Sometimes if we try to get too bogged down in isolating things, we lose the whole movement that we're actually trying to get better. And once we appreciate that there might be a movement like kneeling on the ground that we're trying to actually improve, that's what will actually be useful in our life, then it makes more sense that, well, we need to be stable somewhere, but we also need to be able to move from other joints better. So if we connect our mobility process to our functional activity that we want to improve with, it helps to appreciate this dynamic that stability and mobility are always going to be linked, and we can't really separate them out. All right, and then the third misconception, which I sort of alluded to, is that mobility equals relaxation. So again, that there's this separation in the minds of folks that if we're doing mobility work, it has to be recovery work and it has to be relaxation work. Now that can be true, but it does not have to be true by any means. And depending on how important improving joint mobility is, sometimes it has to feel like quite a bit of work because there's a lot of barriers to be worked through. All right, so the idea is control when we're working on any movement practice. And when we're trying to improve joint mobility, we want to have the control to turn the volume up when it's necessary to turn the volume up and turn the volume down when being a little bit too high threshold or high tension is getting in the way of our mobility practice. So again, if we keep this equation where mobility equals posture plus breath control plus direction, we can fit in whatever intensity we need to make our gains that we're looking for, and we can also fit it into our normal workout routine. So if there are times where we had done some other high intensity work, maybe in the strength training realm, or maybe even in the endurance realm where we put a lot of miles in, then maybe the next day our mobility practice will be a little bit lower intensity to promote a little bit of recovery. But the intention will still be the same, where we have to be mindful of our posture. We have to be mindful of our breath and how we use our breath to gain the direction of motion that we're going for. And then we also can think about how we contract our muscles in the direction that might be limited or in an opposing direction to create some type of relaxation effect to get us to move a little bit farther. So that idea does not necessarily have to be relaxation, and it does not have to be high intensity. There's a continuum or a spectrum that you're always working in, but you're trying to keep those three elements always at the forefront of how we're going to improve joint mobility. So there's quite a bit of time where you may actually need to turn the throttle up on the idea of how you breathe and how you contract your muscles to direct you. So let's say we get to a point where our ankles are limited in dorsiflexion, which would be the idea of bringing the shin forward past the toes. If we get into this idea that we always need to, one, find a stretch, then we might miss out on the fact that our ankle needs to be pulled into a position where we actually can't get into the stretch yet because our ankle is so stiff and so limited that the only way that we can find a stretch in our, say, our calf, which is connected to the Achilles, so if we're seeking that out, we have to keep the knee straight. But oftentimes the most important and best way to work on improving dorsiflexion would be with the knee flexed and kind of creating a little bit of compression over the ankle. As we start doing that, we may lose out on the stretch in the Achilles, and it might feel like we're pretty blocked there. So we can't really relax in that position because our body is so blocked there that we need to actually actively direct ourselves to where the limitation is. So if we're really, really stiff in the ankle and we get into this position that would be trying to gain this range of motion, but our stiffness is knocking us out of position, we have to increase the intensity of our muscle contractions. We have to increase the intensity of our breathing to pull us in the direction of our limitation. And that may happen with the biggest limitations that we have in our soft tissue may need the most aggressive work, at least over time, where we need to build up to that possibility of being stronger in the direction of our limitation. So mobility and relaxation, they can go hand in hand, but they're certainly not the same thing. And if we think of it that way, then we're going to really limit ourselves into what we can gain out of our mobility routine. So oftentimes when I see patients and I'm looking at their joint mobility, it turns into something that feels very much like somebody would consider stability work or core stability work or some type of isometric work. And that isometric work is always appreciating what they currently can't do from a movement perspective. So again, that becomes the most important thing, is looking at where somebody is limited with their motion and then being able to direct them back and limit compensations elsewhere in the body so that they can actually feel what is restricted. And when you feel what is restricted in your body, we've all felt it at different points. It doesn't really feel like stretching a lot of times. It feels like a block. It feels like a hold. And in order to get farther into that range of motion, oftentimes relaxation is not the answer. Now we have to have controlling, and this is where the breath comes in. So if I'm fighting for a position and I'm fighting so hard that I'm just straining like crazy, I don't have good control of that. But I can use my breath to not necessarily enhance relaxation, but to enhance direction and be more in control of what I'm trying to accomplish. So again, we'll use the ankle dorsiflexion example where I find a block where I'm trying to bring my either knees past the toes or my shin past the toes. I feel a block and I can't even explain where I feel it. Maybe it's a little bit in the Achilles, maybe it's the front of the ankle, but there's just a feeling I can't move anymore. That's the direction I'm trying to gain, but at a certain point, there's a limitation there. So now I know I have to pull myself farther into the direction by using the muscles that are involved in that action. So the ankle dorsiflexors are on the front of the shin generally. So we can think about the action of pulling the toes towards the shin and while at the same time moving the shin towards the toes, right? So I'm closing that space, I'm compressing that space. That's going to feel like a lot of work and a lot of effort on that musculature because I'm already kind of at a barrier there. So now I'm trying to move into my barrier and get stronger in that direction of the limitation. And I may have to do that for about 10 seconds release and then see if I can go a little bit farther, see if anything gives. I go into the direction of my limitation even more. When I hit another barrier, if it's the same place, maybe it's a little bit farther, I add the same process of engaging that musculature to try to take me farther and farther forward. That often does not feel like relaxation, or if it does feel like relaxation, you're probably not going to gain much in the direction of your limitation. And again, there might not be very much stretch there because the angle in which we're trying to move the joint isn't putting the long muscles, in this case of the gastrocnemius or the calf muscle, in a stretched position because we're, in this case, bending the knee, which takes the attachment of that muscle and puts it on slack up at its more proximal joint. So that may sound confusing, but the point is that we want to really direct our limitation when we think about joint mobility. A lot of times it can feel very much like strength training, just strength training at our barriers, at our end range. So hopefully that's useful. I wrote a whole book on joint mobility and tried to discuss this from some of the perspective that I was just giving a little preview of here, of how posture, how breath control, how isometric, directional isometrics all play a role in improving our joint mobility at any joint in the body, and also looking at joint mobility with full body functional movements. And a lot of times, again, it's going to be away from some of the common misconceptions out there of that mobility equals stretching or mobility equals relaxation, or that mobility is somehow distinct from stability. So if you want a little bit more information on this topic, be sure to check that out.